Hi, I'm Dalsimer. I'm running for Congress in Virginia's 11th District, and this is my domestic policy gauntlet. And now I'm going to talk about Medicare for All, and do I support it, and will I always support it? The short answer is yes, I support Medicare for All, and I will always support it, and I'll tell you why. To have a universal, single-payer healthcare system, which is what we're talking about, would save, as we all know, nearly $500 billion every year and tens of thousands of lives. It would create thousands of new jobs, and it would promote a system of well care versus a reactionary system to illness. Those are all stats. Here's why I will always support a system that eliminates profit from our healthcare system. In 2015, my husband, Doug, an auto mechanic for 33 years, was diagnosed with terminal bone cancer. He was given about a year to live. In July of that year, he became dehydrated, and I took him to the hospital for fluids. Naively, I left him overnight when the staff said they wanted to keep him for observation. When I came back the next day, my husband was worse, much, much worse. I'm not sure what all they did to him overnight, but it was certainly much more than letting him sleep and giving him fluids. I won't go into detail about the very difficult process that he went through for the following 2 weeks, but it involved him getting a staph infection, requiring a feeding tube, and suffering 2 broken ribs when they came in the small hours of the morning to give him a chest x-ray. Remember, he had bone cancer, which made his bones very brittle. No matter how late I stayed, they would wait till I'd left and come in and do testing, to the point where finally I started spending the night. 2 weeks after taking him to the hospital, I finally took him home. He couldn't walk, and he was going to die. 6 weeks after taking my husband for fluids, he did die. We lost months of life with him. I lost the man I'd loved for a quarter of a century. My children lost their father, and we lost a good man. And why? Because he had excellent insurance. He had great insurance. And the hospital saw him as a cash cow. And they did all kinds of unnecessary and expensive testing on him that he did not need. And that is why I know personally that profit should never, ever be a motive in our healthcare system. And now I'm going to talk about strengthening the Clean Water Act, especially with respect to hydrofracking. And would I support a ban on hydrofracking? And the short answer is yes, absolutely. And this is why. So first, for folks who aren't familiar, hydrofracking literally is a conjunction of hydraulic fracturing, a process developed in the late 1940s, so absolutely not new technology. In fact, very old technology that takes millions of gallons of water mixed with sand and some chemicals and blasts it onto rocks that contain oil and natural gas. It's similar to if you have your garden hose or you put your kitchen faucet on full blast and let the water come out. That's what is happening on a massive scale. And the force of that mixture smashes up the rocks and releases the oil that is contained in there. And as everybody knows from their first grade or elementary school chemistry class, oil and water don't mix, and oil rises to the surface. And so the oil is then able to be collected and utilized. The problem comes from the residuals. What do you do with the slurry? Slurry is contaminated water. That water runs into streams, it gets into the groundwater, it goes into lakes. It causes all kinds of environmental devastation. Some of the chemicals that are leached include arsenic and selenium, in addition to which the process releases huge amounts of methane. And if you've heard me talk about climate change, you know that methane is 87 times more damaging to our climate than carbon is. And how we have got to, if we want to tackle our climate crisis, we have got to get a handle on methane capture and storage. And hydrofracking literally is killing our environment. It's also killing the people who are involved in the actual process and the communities where hydrofracking is going on. The groundwater is contaminated. The air is contaminated and people suffer from respiratory disease, kidney disease, etc., and their lives can be ruined. The people who promote hydrofracking talk about how it brings jobs and money into a community. Well, it does bring temporary jobs to the community, and it brings a little bit of money, but most of the money goes to the oil and gas industry. And when the industry leaves, it leaves behind a trail of environmental devastation and personal human health costs, none of which are captured, none of which they pay for. And those are the reasons why I absolutely do not support fracking. And now I'm going to talk about ICE and whether it should be abolished or reformed. I stand on the side of abolishing ICE. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency was established by George W. Bush. It is younger than my son. It is a brand new agency whose duties were performed by other agencies before it existed. ICE is primarily tasked with dealing with illegal immigration and cross-border crime, such as sex trafficking. These are important things, but there's no reason that we needed a whole new agency to do them. The reason that I think it should be banned, however, is because, especially under the last administration, its budget ballooned by billions of dollars, and the enforcement and the oversight for enforcement has been almost non-existent. It's an agency run amok and out of control. And as we all know from the old quote, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And ICE is suffering from this. There are incidents of sexual abuse, families being separated, children being put in cages, wrongful detention, so much more. And there's no reason that we need a bloated agency with redundant responsibilities that could be handled elsewhere, running amok, creating trauma and devastation for families, engaging in arguably illegal activities. And I think that we should reduce government and save the $8.3 billion that we're spending on it by eliminating ICE and allowing those responsibilities to go back to being performed by the agencies who handled them before. And now I'm going to talk about Amnesty and would I support a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants? Yes, absolutely. And here's why. We have about 10 million illegal immigrants in this country. Many of these peoples are working on farms, they're part of TPS, they're essential workers in some way. They are trying to be productive members of our society. And if we can give them a path to citizenship that is not overly burdensome or expensive, they can become tax-paying, voting members of our society, which will achieve dignity and livability for them and enable our government to be much more egalitarian and representational. It all boils down to Horton hears a who, to paraphrase that, because a person is a person no matter what. And the reality is that our country was founded by immigrants on a premise of being open to all. The words enshrined on the Statue of Liberty have meaning. You've heard me say this before. Words have meaning, and our founding documents are important and need to be really, really taken to heart when looking at how to proceed going forward. So yes, I support amnesty and a path to citizenship for everyone who is working hard to be a part of a productive society. And now I'm going to talk about whether Roe v. Wade should be codified into law. And the answer is yes. Yes, yes. And here's why. Because I'm a woman. It's my body. And with my God and my conscience, I will decide what happens. The reality is, nobody gets an abortion because it's a fun thing to do. It's an agonizing, gut-wrenching, difficult choice to make. And no one takes it lightly. Women throughout time have faced incredible hardships on a number of fronts. and finally having the right to choose, the autonomous ability to choose what happens with her body, with my body, is so vitally important. We cannot let people try to dictate to us how we should handle that situation. The laws that are being passed in Texas and Alabama and Missouri are the start of a wave that could absolutely end up overturning Roe v. Wade, because Republicans have spent decades filling the courts with anti-choice appointments, including Kavanaugh at the Supreme Court. And the reality is that if we can't get the Women's Health Protection Act passed, we're going to lose our ability to make that choice for ourselves. Wealthy women will still find a way, but the vast majority of women who do not have extensive resources will end up in backroom butcher shops, just the way they did before. And we do not want history to repeat itself on this front. We have got to codify Roe v. Wade. My last topic today is about the U.S. Postal Service, and whether we should eliminate the 75-year requirement to pre-fund the pension, and whether post office locations should be allowed to serve as local banks. So first, let's look at the pre-funding of the pension requirement. The reality is that most companies that still have pensions have a requirement to ensure that those pensions will be solvent for at least 40 years out. So while the Postal Service system, with its 75-year requirement, is more onerous, it's not unprecedented. But let's look at the real issue. The vast majority of expenses associated with pre-funding that pension plan are healthcare related. If we have a universal healthcare system in place, the vast majority of those expense requirements disappear, and this becomes a non-issue. So rather than argue over whether or not the post office should pre-fund at some number of years, or how it should be looked at, or should they reduce, let's get a universal healthcare system in place and make the question obsolete. Next, let's look at banking. I absolutely support reinvigorating a system like the 1911 Postal Service banking service. That system was in place from 1911 to 1967. It served marginalized and underrepresented communities, often poor communities, and was wildly popular and successful, and led to the post office having a surplus. So what happened? Well, the big banks got into it, funded their legislators, and we ended up losing the ability to have a nonprofit partisan banking system operated through the Postal Service, and went strictly with for-profit companies that don't operate in poor and underserved communities. Instead, those people end up going to check cashing places that charge astronomical fees, and they get taken advantage of. So absolutely, we need to allow the post office to provide checking, savings, and small loans, and it would create thousands of jobs. So it's a win-win all around. But the bottom line for all these measures, including whether it's post office or Roe v. Wade, is we need to take a hard look at the filibuster. If it weren't for the filibuster, and actually just the threat of the filibuster, we would have universal health care right now, because that was the original Obama plan. And Nancy Pelosi supported it. Joe Lieberman said, if you put that out, I will filibuster. He didn't filibuster. He simply threatened it. And we ended up with the Affordable Care Act. Now, make no mistake, the Affordable Care Act is definitely better than having nothing, or what was there before. But it's still only halfway to the goal of what we need. And as everyone knows, halfway between the right position and the wrong position is still wrong. So we need to really, really push our legislators. We have got to make sure that we end the filibuster so that we can pass all of the excellent legislations that have been discussed today and through the other Gauntlet episodes.